everybody. Great. Good afternoon. My name is Daniel Philpott, and I'm professor in political science here at Notre Dame. Welcome to today's book discussion with Professor Jonathan Fox on his new book, co-authored with Dr. Lev Topor, Why Do People Discriminate Against Jews? Hosted by the Notre Dame Law School Religious Liberty Initiative, at which I am a faculty fellow, and co-sponsored by the Clow Center for Civil and Human Rights. Established in 2020, Notre Dame Law School's Religious Liberty Initiative promotes religious freedom for people of all faiths through scholarship, events, and the law school's Religious Liberty Clinic. It is my honor to introduce Jonathan Fox, who is the Yehuda Avner Professor of Religion and Politics, Director of the Religion and State Project, and a Senior Research Fellow at Bar-Ilan's, that's his home university, Bar-Ilan's Begin-Sadat Center for Strategic Studies. I count Jonathan as a dear friend and a longtime colleague in the new and growing field of religion and politics in the field of political science. He specializes in the influence of religion on politics, which he examines using both quantitative and qualitative methodology. His research also investigates the impact of religion on domestic conflict, terrorism, international intervention, and international relations. I am grateful to Jonathan for his pioneering leadership in this field. It was only a few years ago when so many of us were challenging the dominance of the secularization thesis and calling for bringing religion back in, as the phrase goes. Jonathan, more than anyone, has brought religion back in. He is the most widely cited political scientist in the study of religion. As of this morning, he counted 7,567 citations on Google Scholar. That is high. It's probably even higher right now.
They don't update till tomorrow.
Oh, well, you can check it. His scholarly accomplishments induce vertigo. He is the author, co-editor, or editor of 14 books and over 120 journal articles, and is the producer of the widely used Religion and State dataset. He has received the Distinguished Scholar Award in Religion and International Relations from the International Studies Association and the Suzanne Hobart Rudolph Outstanding Scholar Award in Religion and Politics from the American Political Science Association. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Fox today.
Thank you very much, Dan. Thank you for having me, and thank everybody for coming. After that introduction, this better be good. Okay, so today I'm going to be talking about my book with my colleague Lev Topor, Why Do People Discriminate Against Jews? And I'm going to start with a little bit of Maimonides, who you might not be familiar with, but he's a very important Jewish rabbi who's famous for saying many, many things. But one of them is you cannot define what God is, but you can define what he is not. And I'm going to start with talking about what this book is not about. It's not really about anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism is relevant, but I'm focusing on the causes of discrimination against Jews. Anti-Semitism is very relevant in how you think about what those causes are. It's very important for the implications of my findings, but it is really no part of the research design. It's completely sort of taken out and then put back in at the end, and we'll discuss why in a bit. But obviously there's a relationship between the two. But they are different. For instance, anti-Semitism is a very political, disputed concept, with people defining it in ways that make certain people anti-Semitic and other people not, depending on who they prefer might or might not be anti-Semites. Discrimination is, you can argue about it, but it can be done in a way that's not quite as disputable. Anti-Semitism is specific to Jews. Discrimination can happen to anybody. It's possible to objectively measure discrimination while avoiding political and academic disputes, with the caveat that you can find an academic who will argue with anything, but you can mostly avoid it. And there are normative differences. It's bad to be accused of discrimination, but it's generally considered worse to be considered an anti-Semite. So they're not exactly the same thing. So The research design of this book takes no stand on how anti-Semitism is defined, although if you want a definition, the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance definition is an excellent definition. What types of, I don't take a stand on what types of action, speech, or discrimination are anti-Semitic. I don't take a stand on what types of criticism of Israel are or are not anti-Semitic. I have opinions on that, but they're not relevant to this research. So for example, if I can show that the level of anti-Israel attitudes in a country influences levels of discrimination against Jews, that is true whether or not you define the anti-Israel attitudes or the discrimination as anti-Semitic or not. The relationship's there. We can argue about the role of anti-Semitism once we've figured out what the relationship is. That's basically my approach. So let's start with the data. I know you're mostly lawyers, and data isn't a big thing for you, but we do have to discuss what we're measuring. This is important. I use a religion and state minorities data set, which is a part of the larger religion and state data set. We have data on 771 religious minorities worldwide in 183 countries. That's all countries in the world with at least 250,000 people, plus a few smaller ones. That is all minorities that are 0.2% of a country's population, plus some smaller ones. So this is a very complete list. 76 of these countries include a Jewish minority that's sufficiently sizable to measure. A colleague of mine recently pointed out there are 3 Jews in Malaysia. Why didn't I include them? That's not large enough. You have to have Jews present to discriminate against them. If they're not there, you can't discriminate against them. It's really that simple. All comparisons in the book are within these 76 countries. I can look at other countries, but comparing discrimination against Jews to discrimination against a minority in a country where there are no Jews is not a very meaningful comparison for the type of things we're trying to do. The data is yearly 1990 to 2014. So I'm going to be looking at 2 types of discrimination. The first is government-based religious discrimination, which are restrictions placed on religious institutions or practices of minorities' religions which are not placed on the majority religion. If you restrict all religion in the country, that is most certainly a violation of religious freedom, and it's bad, but it is not discrimination. Discrimination means to treat differently. If you're treating everybody the same, that's something else. It has a very different set of motivations than singling out minorities in a manner in which you do not treat them a majority. There are actually 35 measures in this index that come under the categories restrictions on religious practices, restrictions on religious institutions and clergy, restrictions on conversion and proselytizing, and everybody's favorite social science category, other. But which is just everything that doesn't fall into those categories. I'll give you some more specific examples shortly. But first, let's look at the patterns over time. Now, I broke it down between Christian majority countries and Muslim majority countries because the patterns are a bit different. The white line in between the 2 black lines is discrimination against Jews, which is present, but actually below the mean, less than discrimination against Christian minorities, which would be, say, Orthodox Christians in a Catholic country, or Catholics in an Orthodox country, Protestants in a Catholic country, something like that. It's less than discrimination against Muslims, but more than all minorities that are not monotheistic. So it's present, but not particularly high. In Muslim majority countries, the absolute levels are highest. You can tell by the indicators on the side. I stretched it out so you just can see the differences a little better, but it's lower than against any other minority. Present, but not particularly high against Jews in comparison to other minorities. Now, here are some interesting examples. Now, one of the things I found is very few types of discrimination are present against Jews that are not also present against other minorities. One of the interesting ones, these are particularly interesting because they all are, at least in part, based on secular ideologies which dislike specific religious practices, all of which happen to be practiced by both Jews and Muslims. There's ritual slaughter of meat, which is, the manner in which Jews and Muslims slaughter meat is not liked by people who believe in animal rights because stunning is not allowed. And just for those of you who are legally minded here, and I understand there are a few here, recently the European High Court ruled that these are perfectly okay. And by the way, us Christian secular judges know how to read the Talmud better than you rabbis. And you rabbis are interpreting the Talmud all wrong. That's what we call in the political science chutzpah. So, infant circumcision, which comes from the belief that children have the right to bodily integrity, which their parents may not violate. We're talking about male infant circumcision, not female circumcision of any kind in this study. It's not banned, but it is heavily regulated in several Nordic countries. And for those who are keeping score, in San Francisco for 2 weeks until the court said you can't do that. Modest dress, covering of the hair. Now, most people would assume this applies exclusively to Muslims. However, Orthodox Jewish women do cover their hair, generally in ways that are slightly less visible. They tend to wear wigs or more fashionable hats, so it's not as distinctive. But a number of the bans in these countries, which are not all-out bans, they tend to be in places like public schools, public workers, things like that, would technically apply to an Orthodox Jewish woman. Although I don't know of any cases where that's coming up, that doesn't mean there haven't been that have been a bit below the radar. So these are particularly interesting, and this last one comes to a large extent from secular ideologies concerning women's rights. So we have a clash between secular beliefs on how society should be run and religious practices. So there are others, but I don't have a lot of time. I'll move on. Societal religious discrimination is the second thing I'm looking at. I abbreviate that to SRD like I abbreviate government religious discrimination, GRD, because just that cut like 3-4 pages out of the book, and others like that. It's also gets annoying repeating them all the time. So these are societal actions taken against religious minorities by members of a country's religious majority who do not represent the government. So these are actions coming from society. They include economic restrictions, speech acts, which are people very publicly saying bad things about religious minorities, not on Twitter, not on Facebook. If that were the case, that would just be everywhere. We're talking about more public, common area speech acts, property crimes, nonviolent harassment, and violence. We'll get into some details on that shortly. Societal in Christian majority countries, societal religious discrimination against Jews is way higher than against everybody else, which is a very interesting finding because every theory that exists on this, say, societal and government religious discrimination should be related. That is not what's going on with the Jewish minorities. We're going to get back to that. In Muslim majority countries, it's a bit below the mean, but it's higher than all religious minorities other than Christians. And you'll recall for government religious discrimination was the lowest. So we have a disparity between levels of societal religious discrimination and government-based religious discrimination. And we're going to be looking at the causes of both. For general patterns, all categories of societal religious discrimination against Jews were higher than all other minorities, other than the economic one. Speech acts in the media by clergy, political campaigns by political parties. 3/4 of Jewish minorities experience this. A bit more actually. Also a bit more than 3/4 experience property crimes, vandalism, graffiti. By the way, in the US, there's a disturbing number of swastikas and anti-Jew graffiti in public schools, just public schools that are not Jewish. It's like, we hate Jews, although that's not exactly how they say it, sprayed on school walls, lockers, and stuff like that. Violence, about 70% of religious Jewish minorities experience this. This is very high. So there's a lot going on that we need to explain. So let's look at the causes. I'm going to be looking at 3 causes, and all of these are causes that are hypothesized as causes of anti-Semitism in the anti-Semitism literature. And we transform that a bit to say, well, if it's a cause of anti-Semitism, it's reasonable to assume it might also be a cause of discrimination. And we're testing that. And we're also comparing what the anti-Semitism literature says to what the social science literature says, because there has been some, but not nearly enough interaction between the literatures, and nothing as systematic as we engage in. So We'll start with religious causes, and this is simple. The argument that religious ideology may motivate discrimination against religious minorities is heavily present in the anti-Semitism literature, and it's certainly not unique to it. The literatures don't talk to each other much, but they essentially say mostly the same thing with one major exception. There are two arguments in the social science literature. One is the religious ideology argument, and the other is the religious monopoly argument. Now, you're probably familiar with the religious ideology argument, which you find in the anti-Semitism literature. And I love Rodney Stark's quote for this because it pretty much sums it up in one sentence. Those who believe in only one true God are offended by the worship toward other gods. That sums it up about as well as it can be summed up. So the goals of discrimination are to rid a country of other religions, punish those who believe incorrectly, and perhaps encourage those who do not believe correctly to alter their beliefs and their religious affiliation. Now, the one that you don't find in the anti-Semitism literature, and it's relatively new to the political science literature, is the religious monopoly argument. This is the argument that leaders support a religion because religion makes ruling easier. Leaders don't care about religion. They don't love religion. They support religion because it's good for them. It improves morality, which means there are less costs for law enforcement. You need to spend less money on police, jails, courts. I imagine the latter might bother you guys a little, but you want more money for that. But leaders would like to spend less on that, and if you have a more moral population, you can do that. It also legitimizes the government, which decreases opposition and rebellion and allows them to stay in power longer. But everybody pretty much agrees one of the costs of maintaining a religious monopoly is repressing other religions. So you have the same effect, more religion, more discrimination, but the reasoning behind it, the mechanism is a little bit different. There's really nothing about that in the anti-Semitism literature, but it's growing in the political science literature. So we can definitely measure religion. Now, surveys exist which measure a population's religiosity. I use the World Values Survey because it's really the best cross-country survey, which is something I need if I want to compare across countries. And we use standard variables, percentage of the population that consider religion important in their lives, and percentage of the population which attends religious services at least once a month. State support for religion, I measure in the religion state data set. It's basically a list of 52 ways the government might support religion. How many of them do they do? But we have each one coded individually. Should any lawyers here want to run some data analyses for your law papers and are looking, or if you're just looking for what countries have a particular law or policy and you don't want to run numbers, the information's there in case you're interested. Now, the findings are a little like what you would expect, a little perplexing. Now, I want to emphasize this. There's no influence on how religious people are and levels of government religious discrimination, but the exact opposite relationship you would expect for societal. The more religious a population, the less, not more, less societal religious discrimination, which is the exact opposite of what is predicted. The state support for religion pretty much behaves as you would expect. More state support for religion, more government support discrimination. There is possibly more societal discrimination, but this is a result that people would argue whether or not it was statistically significant. It's significant enough to mention, but not significant enough that everybody would agree it's significant. So let's get back to the really perplexing result. This is what I think is going on. Now, this result is largely driven by Christian majority countries. I don't know what's happening in Muslim majority countries because there are just less of them with Jews and less of them with surveys. So we just don't have the numbers to actually figure out the patterns because you need a certain number of cases for the rules of statistics to apply. And we just don't have that number of cases. So looking at Christian majority countries, what I think is happening is the increasing threat of secularism. And not secularity, secularism as an ideology is changing things. If you talk to religious Christians across the world, the thing they're most worried about is the secular threat, very secular-based restrictions on religion, the secular challenge to religiosity. And that has apparently become a bigger enemy than religious minorities, such as the Jews, and they are seeing other monotheistic religions. These results actually happen to hold for Muslim minorities also. We get basically the same results for Muslim minorities. I don't talk about it in this book, but I have a paper where I look into that with a few sociologist friends of mine. And it's about looking for allies in the fight against secularism. In addition, as we discussed earlier, a good portion of the discrimination against religious minorities is coming from secular ideologies themselves. If you have more religious people in the country, it is reasonable to believe there will be less secular people. You can't really be both at the same time. So I think this has to do with the changing nature of modernity and the role of secularism and the rise of secularism and the rise of something I call secular religious competition, which is something I discuss in detail in other books. If anybody has questions about it, I'm happy to talk about it. But that's what I believe is going on. Moving on to the next cause, anti-Zionism. The argument that anti-Zionism is the cause of discrimination against Jews has some parallels in the general literature. This is basically, the mechanism here would be, is people who are upset at Israel, or whether what Israel's doing, whether it exists, whatever upsets them about Israel, would be taking it out on Jews who live in their country, who are, by the way, generally not Israelis and not at all responsible for Israel's policy, but the Jews are blamed for Israel, and they are punished for it with discrimination. That would be the mechanism of anti-Zionism or the anti-Israel factor causing discrimination against Jews, if such a relationship exists. That's the argument. Now, before we get into is that happening, the question is, what do we compare this to? If you look in the social science literature, where do you find another minority that over space and time for millennia has been treated like this? It's very difficult. Since 1948, find me another minority that has been consistently blamed for the behavior of a country in which they do not live. People don't go around the U.S. attacking Russians because they're upset at Putin, but they do attack Jews, they say, because they're upset at Israel. That happens. So the only close analogy, and it's not a very close analogy I could find, is that Muslims are often held generally responsible for terror attacks committed by Muslims. It's not a great analogy, but it's the closest I could find. There's a whole theory called Securitization Theory, which discusses how leaders securitize the minority through speech acts, which paints them as an existential threat, which allows people and governments to engage in actions against Muslim minorities, and not just all Muslim minorities. This could be applied to pretty much any immigrant minority. It has been. It's really an explanation for how do democracies behave in such undemocratic behavior against certain minorities. You can say the trope of Jewish dual loyalty can be seen as similar, but it's not quite the same thing. But that's the closest you can get to connecting these two theories. There's discussions of Muslims being seen as a cultural threat. Many people consider that they don't assimilate, they're different, they don't behave like Westerners, and therefore that attracts discrimination because there are people who feel this way. Now, again, not the best analogy, but we actually end up looking at the Jewish dual loyalty trope, Jews seen as foreigners, is the possible analogy. So on the Jewish side, the securitization and the cultural arguments sort of converge on the trope of Jewish loyalty and Jewish foreignness. Some other less relevant analogies are groups associated with an enemy state, such as, say, the Japanese in the U.S. during World War II, Huntington's Clash of Civilizations theory, which is not at all a good analogy, and Taiwan and the Turkish government of Cyprus, which are the only other two governments in the world that some states consider not legitimate, but not very good analogies. So this is something that's relatively unique to Jews. But we can measure it. There was a major survey done in 2014 and follow-ups, but 2014 is a relevant one because that overlaps with my data, by the Anti-Defamation League. Among the questions they asked were the standard Israel like, dislike, Palestine like, dislike questions. So I can measure percentage of the people of the country who dislike Israel and or like Palestine. I can also measure how often a country votes against Israel in the UN. So we can get government behavior, we've got a societal variable. And none of these variables measure anti-Semitism, anti-Zionism, which is bad if you want to measure anti-Zionism, but it's good if you want to pull all the normative stuff out of the study. It's simply measuring anti-Israel beliefs and behavior. And you don't really have to attach anti-Zionism or anti-Semitism to it. You can see what the results are, and then maybe discuss what are its implications for anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism. So this is actually an advantage from my point of view. Now, the statistical results are interesting and a little perplexing. The attitudinal variables explain government-based religious discrimination. If you like Palestine, if you have more people who like Palestine or dislike Israel, you're going to have more government-based religious discrimination in the country. The relationship to societal religious discrimination is so weak that it's not really statistically significant, but it's strong enough that I want to put it up on the board, to be honest, but there's not a lot there. If you look at the countries voting in the UN, anti-Israel voting really predicts government-based religious discrimination in Christian majority countries. It doesn't work for Muslim majority countries, mostly because Muslim majority countries vote almost uniformly against Israel. And if you have no variation, you can't predict anything with statistics. It's like saying, well, how many women are women? Which I guess is more of a problem than it used to be, but it's a good example. So it does predict actually less societal religious discrimination. I don't know why, but it's very clear that the Israel factor is not creating more societal religious discrimination, which is an important finding for a number of reasons. So overall, we have a much better explanation from the Israel factor for governments than we do for society. And this actually suggests anti-Israel attitudes are more influential in elite circles than popular circles, which fits well with securitization theory, with elite speech acts stigmatizing a minority, but it doesn't seem to be having results on the ground with people on the ground outside of government. It also runs counter to the argument that societal actions against Jews are motivated by anti-Israel sentiments, because if they were, we would see more of them in countries with more anti-Israel sentiments, and we don't. So that's I'll get back to that in a little bit. Now we're going to look at the final explanation: conspiracy theories. The basic argument is the more people believe in conspiracy theories of Jewish power, the more they will discriminate against Jews. Conspiracy theories are very big in the anti-Semitism literature. The anti-Semitism literature tends to focus on the origins of these conspiracy theories, classifying them, maybe how they've evolved a bit over time. I put up the major ones on the board. The world domination one is very common. The other ones actually mix with the world domination one. Blood libels go back to the argument that Jews use Christian babies' blood to cook the matzahs after Passover. I've cooked matzahs, we don't. And I certainly don't. It's just in case anybody was wondering, this is actually still very popular in the Muslim world. They have like their equivalent of NCIS has like cases catching Jews using Muslim babies for using the blood for the matzahs. Just whatever. We have people who monitor that. You can watch the video. You can watch the TV shows on YouTube at certain Jewish sites showing that this goes on. If you don't believe me, the well poisoning that dates back to the Black Plague, where the Jews were causing the Black Plague by poisoning the wells. Later, when they figured out the Jews weren't poisoning the wells, because they couldn't get to the wells, they accused the Jews of cursing the wells, which is much harder to disprove. And of course, murder of religious figures. Not just Jesus, Jews are also blamed for killing Muhammad, in case you're keeping score. So that's what's going on there. But let's just move on to the general conspiracy theory, which is a very interesting rabbit hole of theory. Just not that the studies are very interesting, but it's such a rabbit hole when you start looking at how these things work. One of the more interesting studies was a 1994 study based on a 1992 survey in New Jersey that found the majority of people who were surveyed in New Jersey believed in at least one conspiracy theory. This has been repeated around the world in different places. They've never, ever gotten a result ever that didn't have a majority of people believing in conspiracy theories. So conspiracy theories are not a fringe thing. This is a common thing in society. A lot of people believe them. In the book, I go very deeply into elected political figures across Europe and the US openly spouting Jewish conspiracy theories, so that this is not a fringe thing. This is something real. It's widely believed. It's in politics, so it's worth looking into. We also know that people who believe in one conspiracy theory are likely to believe in others. Populists are more likely to believe in conspiracy theories, and conspiracy theories are extremely resistant to empirical proof that contradicts them. The empirical proof just becomes part of the conspiracy theory itself. So it's very difficult to disprove. And actually, just simply mentioning a conspiracy theory to people, even criticizing it, makes them more likely to believe it. It's a very pernicious, dangerous thing. So I'm feeling a little bad about mentioning the matzah thing. So, all right, but I will trust you guys not to take my word for it, and that Jews don't do that. God, why would we want to? But anyway, are conspiracy theories against Jews more common, pernicious, and dangerous? I really don't know, but somebody always asks that. But it doesn't really matter. To test the question, I just need to measure conspiracy theories, and I need it to vary across countries, and I can test the impact. And I have that. The ADL survey, which I mentioned before, has an anti-Semitism measure where it gives 11 statements and asks people to agree or disagree with them. And 6 of them, these 6, and we'll just blow them up so you can see them a little bigger, are pretty much conspiracy theories of Jewish power. Jews have too much power in the business world, international finance markets, global affairs, United States government, and control the government media. And while we're at it, we cause all wars. So those sound like conspiracy theories of Jewish power to me. So we tested these measures and the other 5 just for fun, and a measure that puts all of them together by measuring the percentage of people who believe in at least any 5 of the 11, minimum of 5 of the 11, and this is what we got. Now, the black checks are 100% statistically significant. The yellow checks are marginally statistically significant. Again, this wouldn't be considered statistically significant for most purposes, but it's enough that it's worth mentioning. And here are the 6 tropes of Jewish media control. They predict societal religious discrimination and government religious discrimination very strongly. The only other trope that predicts both is the blaming the victim one, where people hate Jews because of the way they behave. It's our fault. So now there's a theory called the Canary in the coal mine theory, that anti-Semitism is actually a sign of a deeper malaise in society than just hatred of Jews. So just for fun, we thought we'd check that and see if these tropes predict discrimination against minorities which are not Jewish. Remember, my study has 773 religious minorities across the world, 771, most of which are not Jewish. So for these 76 countries, which we checked, does it predict discrimination against religious minorities that are not Jewish? And the answer is yes, it does. Almost as well as it does against Jews. If you believe Jews have too much power in the business world, that's going to predict societal discrimination and government-based religious discrimination. The only one of these 6 tropes that doesn't predict societal is that Jews have too much power in the international finance markets, which I really don't understand how that's different from the business world, but apparently it is in the minds of people. Also, it doesn't predict Jews have too much control of global affairs, but 4 of the 6 tropes predicts also the Jews are responsible for their own discrimination type tropes. So we have something going on. Now, for additional fun, we checked the Israel thing, and that also predicts. It actually predicts societal religious discrimination against non-Jews better than it does against Jews. So this is where we're coming to a conclusion that maybe this is a sign of a general malaise in society. But the only counter argument is intersectionalism. Discrimination begets discrimination. It's but so God people that discriminate against one or discriminate against other. It's not a sign of central malaise. Well, if that were the case, the discrimination against Jews would predict discrimination against non-Jews. And it does for government-based religious discrimination. Government-based discrimination, if governments discriminate against one, they discriminate against another. So that's probably due to a basic problem, a malaise in the government, but doesn't predict societal discrimination. So the actual tropes of Jewish power predict societal discrimination better than actual levels of discrimination against Jews if we're looking at non-Jews. That's interesting, and that's a sign that this whole belief in conspiracy theories, anti-Semitism, all this belief stuff, and this whole canary in the coal mine theory about Jews, that there's something to it. So this is not a problem. Anti-Semitism is a sign of not just a problem for Jews, it's a sign of problems for all minorities. And this is the Religious Freedom Center, and I'm talking about religious minorities. So I wouldn't exactly define these variables as the perfect measures of religious freedom, but they're certainly heavily related to religious freedom. So, how do we need to think differently about discrimination? Well, religion isn't always a cause of discrimination. It can be a cause of tolerance. The dynamics which causes discrimination can change over time, because I guarantee you, we look a few hundred years ago, societies that were more religious probably did engage in more discrimination against Jews. We need much more research on the influence of conspiracy theories on discrimination. No one's ever actually checked what belief in conspiracy theories does to actual behavior in the real world against the objects of those conspiracy theories. As far as I know, this is the only study that does that. Jews may not be the only canary in the coal mine, and we certainly need more research on blaming and collective punishment. What did we learn about anti-Semitism? Well, anti-Israel views and actions are likely linked to anti-Semitism, but this seems mostly, currently at least, or at least during the time of the study, to be an elite phenomenon, and it's not a math formula. We have countries that say voted against Israel 100% of the time, and there's no measurable discrimination against Jews in those countries. It's a probability, not a certainty. We're not talking about historical determinism in the Marxist sense here. It's a probability. It also means that societal actions taken against Jews are likely caused by factors other than anti-Semitism, even when the perpetrators say otherwise. Because again, if anti-Zionism and the anti-Israel factor predicted was the actual cause of discrimination against Jews in society, we would see more of it in places where they dislike Israel more. That's only logical. We're not seeing that. So when people say they're attacking Jews because they don't like Israel, I don't believe them. I call bovine scatology on that. So I do. That's an official political science term, by the way. So anti-Semitism has greater consequences when present among elites than when present in society. That's not particularly surprising, but it's important to note. And tropes of Jewish power are the most dangerous forms of anti-Semitism. Anytime somebody gets up and starts talking about these tropes in a public place, this could very easily have real-world consequences for Jews and possibly for other religious minorities also. So these things are significant. That's the book. It's fine. I'm happy to take questions.
So I have sort of a question, and then I ask you sort of observation. The observation is, so to the extent to which anti-Zionism, the problem is like a two, you're serving two masters problem, or maybe serving Israel more than you are the U.S. Isn't that the best analogy of 19th century anti-Catholicism in the United States, where the theory of anti-Catholicism was that the Catholics were disloyal to the United States because they are primary loyalty. Maybe later, but it seems like
that's actually a great analogy that I did not think of, and it's not surprising I had to come to Notre Dame to find it out. And that's if you had mentioned that to me before I wrote the book, I would have 100% put it in there, but it's a little late for that. But I will say that it's a good analogy in the dynamics, but it's not one that persists over space and time, which still makes the Jewish experience a bit different. But it would definitely be one worth mentioning.
So the question is, so there's a trope that if the government, supports religion, let's say gives school vouchers or something, it's going to cause division in the culture. So when you're talking, and you find a link between government support of religion and discrimination, but when you're talking about that, is that neutral benefits like, education funding, or is it specific to religion? So you get it to, it would be like you get it to go to the Jewish school, or the Catholic school, but you don't get it to just go wherever.
Okay. The measure includes 52 ways government might support religion. A good number of them are government enforcement of religious ideology, which including restrictions on abortion, because I get arguments from Dan about that all the time. But you can pop that measure out and get the same result. It includes all sorts of ways government might finance religion. It doesn't measure whether it's preferential or not preferential, although that's something I'd like to measure in future versions of the data set. That's one of the things I plan to add in the next round. It includes government entanglement between government and religion, religious officials and government officials sort of flipping places, things like that. Presence of religion, religious education, public schools, just a whole slew of things combined. That's the measure, so it really includes all of that. But a difference of one measure and another isn't different. We're talking like countries can do anywhere between 0 and the Saudis get into the 40s. Nobody does all 52. The Saudis get into the mid to high 40s for all of these, and they're the highest. Iran is following, but not nearly as close, surprisingly. So, but there's a lot of variation. Western democracies go from anywhere between 1 or 2 of these to about, I think Greece is around 17 or 18. So it's a wide range. Okay.
So I'm going to illustrate your point about lawyers not really knowing much about data. Feel free.
Sure.
Feel free to
It's not what you're trained to do. There's nothing wrong with that.
2 things about the study design I was just curious about. One, kind of early on, you noted that you were only going to be looking at countries where there was some sort of meaningful Jewish population.
Correct.
Because, as I think you said, if they're not there, how can you discriminate against them? But I wonder, what about countries where the reason they're not there is because they were discriminated against? Or where they used to be there and left, or where they would be there but choose not to come because they fear they would be discriminated against? It seems like that might be tough to measure, but it seems like a phenomenon that's going to just fall out of your study that might be worth knowing more about. Second thing, when you were talking about societal discrimination, SRD, if I understood the slide right, that discrimination is defined as societal discrimination coming from a member of the religious majority
Yes.
to a minority. So am I right that
Yes.
drops out intra-minority societal discrimination?
As much as we can. If we don't know who did it, we assume it was the majority. But if we know it was a member of the minority that did it, we don't include it in that particular variable. A lot of cases you don't know who did it.
But what if it were the case that might well be, say, a country, let's say Egypt, which I assume is Muslim majority.
Yeah.
Let's say there's some Coptic Christians, and those Coptic Christians are discriminating against Jews all the time. That just falls out of your. That's not.
That would, but there's not a lot of that going on in Egypt. It's the Copts are definitely getting slammed by the Muslims. The few Jews that are left in Egypt have their issues, although probably not nearly as much as the Copts.
The intra-minority stuff.
The intra-minority stuff. To the best we can, we don't. To the best of our ability, we don't include it. But there are a lot. Somebody draws a swastika on a wall and you don't know who did it. You can't filter that out. So, but to the best of our ability, we do discount that. Okay, so we'll go to the back of the. And on the your discussion about places where there are no Jews because of anti-Semitism, or frankly, in certain countries they were just kicked out in 1948. You're absolutely right. That is a phenomenon we're studying, and other people study it. It's not the kind of thing I have any way to include in a research design like this. This is Jews are present in the country. What is happening to them? That's the basic assumption we're looking at here. And how would you even measure whether or not why Jews?
Look for immigration restrictions.
You could. Well, I guess you could look at Saudi Arabia that doesn't let anybody who's not Muslims in, and that's important, but that's not particular to Jews either. And I actually have a variable for that, for restrictions on immigration or citizenship based on religion. There is a variable for that in the data set. It's not a religious discrimination variable. It's in a different part of the data set. So that's something we could look at. I guess it would be possible to correlate that with discrimination against Jews, but it's not a variable that's coded often enough that we'd likely get results. You need something coded. You need more variation to find results. So I don't think we got results off of that, but in theory we could. Because I believe we had a question in the back of the room, the guy in the red shirt, I think. Yeah.
So this may have been implicitly or even explicitly in the data set, but I was wondering about the situations in which you said that certain countries would vote 100% of the time against Israel at the United Nations. But that did not necessarily equate to or cause or show increased discrimination against Jews in their country.
In society.
So my question is, was there anything in the data or anything in the book that describes maybe how those countries, when they voted, or how they voted, if they said anything against, Israel, or I guess maybe this might be communication or what were the politics behind the vote?
UN votes don't really work like that. You just call a vote and maybe a few people give speeches and then you vote, but not everybody gives speeches. We didn't look at the speeches. There are people doing studies where every year, every country sends somebody to give like a lecture, a speech at the UN. There are people who've been collecting the full text of those speeches and using them for analyses of how people were talking about international relations. So it would certainly be possible to construct a variable of countries that are mentioning Israel in those speeches and correlating it with my discrimination variables, but so far as I know, nobody's done that. But it would be something that if I were to go about it, I'd probably use those speeches because that's something every country does. So you could actually compare across countries, and we could actually do this for countries whether or not Jews are present in the country. And we could actually do it for every year they gave the speech for which I have data. So we could actually have quite a few cases if we wanted to go about doing that. So if I were to do such a study, that's how I would do it. But I don't know what the results would be. Okay. Who's actually behind you, then you? Okay. He had his hand up first, sorry.
Well, no, she did actually.
Okay. Well, we'll do it that way anyway. We'll get to everybody, I promise, or I'll try.
Sure. So I thought the point about conspiracy theories was interesting, and I just wanted to ask about, like, just to clarify in the study, when the study measured on people believing at least one conspiracy theory in New Jersey, I think it was.
Yeah, that was the Gartzel study. Yeah.
Yeah. Was the conspiracy theory particular to Jewish people causing this, or just a conspiracy theory?
No, it was a general conspiracy theory paper. I don't think none of the ones they mentioned in the paper, as best I recall, had anything to do with Jews. A number of the ones in other studies, they've done the studies across the world. In Muslim majority countries, Israel is usually prominent in the conspiracy theories mentioned. Which conspiracy theories rise to the most popular ones just varies across time and place. Sometimes they involve Jews in Israel, sometimes they don't. My point was more that conspiracy theories tend to be widely believed, so it's worth looking at this because it's not a fringe phenomenon. That was the basic point, and I gave the first study because I figured I deserve credit. I think they deserve credit for coming up with the idea of doing this. Everybody else who's been doing has basically been repeating their study in other places with a few minor nuances. No, that was the larger point. It wasn't an Israel or Jew-based study in any way of which I'm aware. Okay, please.
I have another data question.
Sure.
I thought it was interesting that you said the more religious a society was, the less social religious discrimination there was.
Correct.
How are you defining the religious, or I guess what are the benchmarks to determine whether?
Okay, well, like I stated, I'm using the World Value Survey, and they ask questions in a whole bunch of countries, and the two variables I'm using, and the results are the same for both variables, is percentage of the people in the country who say religion is at least somewhat important to their lives, because it's a 4-variable scale, so we cut it off as somewhat important. If you run it as important only, you get about the same results, but since that's a less common result and there's less variation, it's not as strong. But most people use the somewhat when they do this at the country level. And the other one was percentage of people who attend religious services at least once a month. It's either once a month or once a week. And there's lots of people who go most weeks but miss a week, so we wanted to catch the people who show up at least once a month. Those are very standard variables. They weren't collected by me. These are part of the World Value Survey. It's if you look at sociologists, when they measure religion, they think the two important things are belief and practices. And so we have a measure for belief, we have a measure for practice. Those are very standard measures for belief and practices. So we captured both aspects of religiosity, the way sociologists conceive of them, and they really think about it the most, at least among the social scientists.
Towards the end of your presentation, and thanks for this, by the way, it's very interesting. At the end, you mentioned that there's an association that government-based discrimination against Jews predicts government-based discrimination against other religious minorities.
Yeah,
but
that was
it doesn't
yeah.
predict social-based
Right, and
discrimination.
neither does social-based discrimination against Jews. It does not. It's same pattern. It predicts government-based discrimination, but does not predict societal discrimination against other Jews. Against other religious minorities.
Right. I was wondering, do those government-based discrimination? It's so often when a government wants to discriminate against a religious minority, especially against Jews, perhaps. I shouldn't say generally, but very often they might do so in a way that doesn't sort of call out Jews specifically. It looks bad often for government to sort of target a religious minority. So I wondered if there's an association between government-based discrimination that targets Jews and happens to also predict non-Jewish religious minority discrimination. Are those the same laws, or are those different laws that the same way we have both kinds of laws, or is it really just the same law that's
both. I don't discuss this so much in this book, but in one of my other books, Thou Shalt Have No Other Gods Before Me, Why Governments Discriminate Against Religious Minorities. And you'll note the place I stole that title from does not have a copyright. So it's perfectly okay if there are any lawyers in the room who might be upset about that. So, sorry, I have to do the occasional lawyer joke. But one of the findings is, first of all, discrimination is very ubiquitous. Close to 90% of countries worldwide discriminate against religious minorities, and the West is no different, and actually in many ways much worse than a good part of the world, including large chunks. The West is actually much worse than, say, Christian majority non-democracies in the non-West. As far as levels of discrimination. So the West is not a bastion of religious freedom, but that's a completely different talk. And governments which discriminate against one minority will generally discriminate against others, but almost all governments that discriminate unequally. Some minorities get it worse than others. So you have some cases where the discrimination is against several or most minorities. You have cases where one religious minority is singled out. Most of the discrimination in Christian majority countries by governments, I would say, probably does not single out Jews. It's part of something that's also restricting other religious minorities. There are some isolated cases where probably is specifically against Jews, but I can't remember the examples. There are so few of them, but that's probably the exception to the rule. So the societal religious discrimination is very much targeted against the minority in question and varies greatly across minorities. It's also utterly common for it to occur in a country, but the patterns are quite different. I hope that answers the question.
It would make sense that societal discrimination is going to be targeted against the target of the discrimination. Which Jews is clearly aimed at Jews, whereas you can imagine many like a circumcision ban might be sort of deliberately cast widely in order to catch everybody and avoid any target.
People who are looking to ban circumcision tend to come into two categories: people who are just genuinely against the practice, generally for ideological reasons, and people who don't like Jews and or Muslims who are looking for a PC excuse to restrict them. And it's sometimes hard to tell the difference between the two. Sometimes, given the people saying it, not so hard. Okay? We'll go with you.
I'm wondering if your study and your data makes any distinction between Jewish people who are sort of visibly Jewish and practicing, and people who are more secularly Jewish. It seems that a lot of the measures of discrimination, especially government-sponsored discrimination, would be targeting the former, especially with regards to clothing practices, whether you could wear a head covering in a public space. Whereas the conspiracy theory thesis for discrimination would apply to Jared Kushner and Larry David, who are kind of complete opposites in some sense of the political spectrum.
Jared Kushner and Larry David are visible Jews because everybody knows they're Jewish.
Right, but
So,
But like in
Okay.
terms of like the measures of discrimination. So I guess my question is,
okay.
are there some societies that are targeting the former? So like where discrimination against practicing like Hasidic Jews or Jewish people who are more like conservative, more orthodox is incredibly high, but discrimination against Jews who would be identified more as secular is not so high.
Well,
Or the reverse, where you have countries that might be like sympathetic to visible religious practitioners who are more conservative or orthodox, but not necessarily those who are viewed as more secular.
okay, well, the study isn't really aimed to get at that, but the government measure looks specifically at restrictions on religious practices and institutions. So this would influence people who care about religious practices and institutions more than people who don't. If you're a Jew who doesn't ever go to synagogue, doesn't ever practice anything, doesn't care about circumcision, doesn't cover your hair, doesn't care about kosher slaughter, these are not going to affect you. So in effect, the government, as I'm measuring it, the government restrictions would target people who care about the religion or practice the religion more. The societal religious discrimination tends to, for all religious minorities, cluster more against visible members of the minority. If they don't know you're a member of a minority, they can't really target you. So, but then again, you have things like I said, in the public and public schools, it's in the U.S. It's the ADL puts out an incident report every year, and it's disturbing how many of these incidents are just people putting anti-Semitic graffiti in public schools, many of which don't even have any Jews. So, but again, visible minorities tend to be targeted more when you're talking religious buildings get graffiti far more than private property. It's far more common, but private property owned by Jews does get it quite a bit, and a lot of targets are targets of opportunity. You see some of the minority you don't like on the street and you attack them if this is what you wanted to do. I don't think I have to teach you how to do that because you wouldn't do it, and you could probably figure it out if you wanted to, but that's basically how it works. But you would have to be able to identify them as members of the minority to target them. So sort of by definition, most of the societal discrimination would be against visible members of the minority. Okay. Sure, I haven't heard from you guys, so 1 or 2, and we'll see if we have time after that.
I have a small question.
Sure.
Why would secularism be a threat towards religious liberty? Especially the data you don't provide, for example, information about Latin America. Almost all Latin American countries are secular states, and they have really progressive, let's say, human rights decisions towards the protection of Jews. For instance, in Colombia, you have a lot of decisions. For example, the state cannot perform like state exams or obligate people to do things on Saturday, and they move many things to Sunday just to respect the right to Jews to stay on Saturdays at home and don't need to perform something. So I don't know why it would be necessary to be a threat to religious liberty and secularism.
It isn't necessarily a threat. There are two things that they're definitely, I believe there are religious Christians who perceive it as a threat, and I know this because they say so. If you want a good example in the U.S., listen to Pat Robertson sometime. He talks about it all the time, and he's not alone. So there are definitely Christians who consider secularism a threat to religion. Now, if we're talking about as a source of discrimination against religious minorities, I agree with you. There's not much of that in Latin America. In fact, Latin America and sub-Saharan Africa are among the most tolerant regions in the world for religious minorities in general, not just Jews, far more tolerant than Western democracies, which is a finding that tends to surprise a lot of people. I don't see many indications there of the secular ideology and secular activists looking to engage in manners which restrict public religion. I do see it in Western democracies. So this is not an issue that has reached Latin America, and I'm not enough of an expert on Latin American culture to even predict whether it could possibly some point in time in the future have any legs there or not. Colleague of mine, Dennis Petrie, works a lot on Latin America. I might ask him. He might have a better idea. He's currently located in Costa Rica. So he might have a better idea, and that's certainly an interesting question. So your observations are almost certainly correct, and this is a phenomenon we're seeing far more in the West right now than anywhere else. Whether it's going to spread or not, I hope not, but I don't know. Sure.
First one is how you do human behavior number. The second is to what extent are you going to say that a certain just a cultural difference.
Sorry, I didn't hear the first part of the second question. Can you speak up a little?
To what extent you can say that a certain action could be considered just a cultural difference instead of discrimination.
Okay.
And it seems to me that your analysis, you're thinking, maybe I'm wrong, that's why I'm asking, that you're thinking that religion is sort of legal device. Is that the way that you see religion?
Okay, those are three very big questions. No, they are. The first question, there's a whole science and political science called events data, which is a methodology for turning things that happen in the real world to data you can analyze. I have an hour and a half lecture on how you go about doing that, so I'm going to leave it at that. But there's a whole science on that. It dates back to the 1960s, and my mentor Ted Gurr was one of the founders of the type of people who do that. So if you accept that methodology, I was trained by one of the best. As far as, I'm sorry, I forgot the other two questions. Sure.
How you can differentiate between.
Okay, the cultural, okay. All right, the things I measure in society are very obvious actions. People go ahead and attack the religious minorities. I mean, I guess you could say that's cultural, but I would still call it discrimination. It can be, but the things we're looking at, most people would consider discrimination of the majority against the minority. You're attacking them, you're burning down their places, you're harassing them. I mean, is there a cultural element to that? Most probably, but it's still discrimination. What was the final question?
Whether you understand that religion is a political device.
It is, but it's not only that. That's the functionalist argument in sociology is the religion can be explained through its functions in society, and therefore it's a tool. And the only thing, and so you shouldn't bother studying it. You look at whoever's using the tool. Marx's religion is the opiate of the masses would be an example of a functionalist argument. It's a very good, it's possibly the best known example of a functionalist argument. And it's an interesting discussion, but it basically comes down to, yeah, of course people use religion as a political device, but I would point out it wouldn't work if beliefs didn't influence behavior. And beliefs influencing behavior is something independent of it being used as a political device. So that's there, but it's not just that. That's how I look at it. Not everybody would agree. Okay. Back of the room. Oh, I'm sorry. It looks like we're done. Sorry, Francesca. Francesca is calling an end to this. So, but I can stick around and answer a few questions if anybody has any.
And we quick couple of announcements. There's copies of this book to buy outside, and also Chipotle. So please help yourselves. And yes, thank.
By the way, I have an hour and a half lecture also on the functionalist.